The year is 1898. William McKinley is president. He'll be assassinated in 3 years, and the youngest man to ever hold the office will succeed him, Teddy Roosevelt. Most of America gets around by horse and buggy, some by train. Henry Ford has yet to build the car that will bear his name. It'll be 5 years before Wilbur and Orville Wright launch their flight on North Carolina's Outer Banks. Most of America's homes are lit by kerosene lamps. And it will be the last time that Republicans have a majority in both houses of the General Assembly of North Carolina. That was then. The Republican Party sat on the sidelines while the 20th century passed in front of us. It's incredible to think, isn't it, that people born at the turn of the 20th century who lived into their 70s would have seen both the right's tentative break with gravity and a heavier than air man-powered craft, and witnessed Neil Armstrong stepping on the surface of the moon, but they would never see a Republican majority in both houses of the General Assembly. That was then. People living in the roaring 20s in North Carolina would have seen Babe Ruth hit 60 home runs, Charles Lindbergh fly the Atlantic, America saved Western civilization twice in World Wars I and II, witnessed the beginning and the end of the Cold War, but they would never see a Republican majority in both houses of the General Assembly. That was then. A little over 18 months ago, the Democratic Party in North Carolina took us to the woodshed and administered an electoral butt-whipping of epic proportions. They won a Senate seat that had been ours since 1972, held for 30 of 36 years by Jesse Helms, God rest his soul. They won the governor's race again. And for the first time since 1976, when Billy Carter's older, dumber brother carried North Carolina's electoral votes, we lost the presidency. How did they do it? Well, first of all, they had an embarrassment of wealth because the Obama campaign raised $800 million in 2008. And what that helped finance was 47 campaign offices in the state of North Carolina manned by over 400 paid staffers. In the course of a year, they registered 967,804 new voters. I want you to think about that for a minute. In the span of 1 year, North Carolina went from 5 million registered voters to 6 million registered voters. 8 out of 10 of that million new voters were Democrats or unaffiliated. And then, in early voting, they voted 2.6 million people, which is more people than actually voted on Election Day. And 7 out of 10 of those early voters were unaffiliated. That was then. This is now. We picked ourselves up, we dusted ourselves off, and we recommitted ourselves to the hard work of not only saving our party, but a bigger job, saving our country. Last year, we won mayor's races in Democratic strongholds like Greensboro, Kinston, and Lincoln, and statewide 400 Republicans were elected. And this year, we recruited a record number of Republican candidates, many of whom were in hotly contested primaries. Because this is the new Republican Party, where valiant men and women compete to carry our party's banner into battle rather than being begged to be on the ticket just because they happen to be registered Republican and have a pulse.
That's right.
And if you were looking for primary action in North Carolina in 2010, you looked at the Republicans, not the Democrats. And that's exactly what 54% of the unaffiliated voters did in the most recently conducted primary. They chose the Republican primary to vote in. Only 42% chose the Democratic Party, and that 13% gap, if it continues, if it holds, will be decisive in the next election. This is now. And in the 2010 primary, in addition to winning a healthy majority of independents and unaffiliateds, we closed the gap in early voting, and we actually won the absentee ballot voting in the primary. This is now. This is now, and in the area of political fundraising, for the first time in anyone's memory at the end of the quarter, the North Carolina Republican Party had more cash on hand than the Democratic Party did. But this is the present, Republicans. This is now. And it's only the end of the first quarter. And most of the battle is ahead of us. And this battle will principally be fought about two things: him and her, Barack and Bev. Let's talk about our president for a minute, who came to power in the White House with the thinnest resume and less political experience of any previous occupant, and his activities in office have reflected that lack of experience. First, he set the tone for his presidency by traveling to the Middle East and bowing and scraping to princes and potentates and apologizing for what America is and what it has done in the world, thereby completely showing a lack of understanding about our history and our heritage, and also a lack of understanding that job one of the American president is to stand up for Americans. It got worse. How many of you have served or had a family member serve in the armed forces of the United States? Please stand. Raise your hand. God bless all of you. Did you catch the president's press conference where he said, and this is a verbatim quote, "I do not expect the occupation of Afghanistan to continue indefinitely"? Did you catch that word, occupation? No, Mr. President. We are not an occupying force in Afghanistan. We are a liberating force, and if it not were for us, the occupying force that was there, the Taliban would still be terrorizing the people of Afghanistan and people all over the globe. Once again, a betrayal of a complete lack of understanding of his role as Commander-in-Chief, and an outrageous insult to the brave men and women who serve in the American Armed Forces in that part of the world, alleging them to be an occupying force. Then there's Acorn. Now, Mr. President, we know you're a big picture guy, but to claim not to know that Acorn was getting federal money when they received over $50 million in federal funds, in our tax dollars. Now, I know it's a big budget. You could lose $50 million, I suppose. But it does point out one of two things. The president is either dangerously out of touch, or he is what that congressman from South Carolina said he was. And Richard Burrs told you all about health care reform that you need to know, but the tide started to turn in this country. It started to turn against the president, and it started to turn against health care when they had to bribe three of their own senators $500 million. $100 million to Chris Dodd, $100 million to Ben Nelson, $300 million to Mary Landrieu to get them to vote for that stinker of a bill. How could that be a good thing for the people of America if they had to bribe their own senators to vote for it? And that's when things started to turn for this president. Finally, there's his nominee for the Supreme Court, who, as dean of the Harvard Law School, in a time of war, prohibited armed services recruiters from appearing on her campus in a time of war. And she will be sitting on the Supreme Court of the United States. Now let's talk about her for a minute, or as I like to call her, $1 billion Bev. For most of her tenure in office, she's been the most unpopular governor in the United States, or as I'm fond of pointing out, you know you're having a bad day when your approval numbers are worse than Mark Sanford's. And there's a reason for it. First, if you'll remember, as a candidate for governor, when she was running against my good friend Pat, she said she wouldn't raise taxes. Barely 2 months into office, she proposed $1.5 billion in tax increases, and she signed a budget that had $1 billion worth of tax increases